I'm Adam Kahane. I'm here at University of Stellenbosch Business School, just giving a talk at Leaders Angle about my experience working with multi-sector leadership teams on solving tough problems, and in particular on the way in which this work in essence involves working both with power and with love. What does it take to effect change peacefully in the increasingly complex, confusing, and conflictual contexts in which we all find ourselves? The answer I've come up with to that question has to do with power and love. By power, I do not mean only power over, only oppression, although that's part of the story. And by love, I do not mean only falling in love, romance, although that's part of the story. The first story I want to tell you is the story of how I got started in this work, very close to here. In 1988, I went to work for Royal Dutch Shell at their head offices in London, and I went to work in the scenario department, that group of people founded by Pierre Vac under Arie de Geus, who helped the company develop its strategy by telling stories about how the future might unfold. I enjoyed the fact that, that Shell was able to do something in the world, and this idea that the way you made progress on things, the way you dealt with complex issues, was by different people vigorously arguing and pushing for what they wanted, was very much a flavor of the time. That was the end of the Thatcher era. I was working in Shell in 1991 when we received this phone call from Peter LaRue at the University of the Western Cape, saying that there was a group at UWC that wanted to use the Shell scenario method to think about the transition away from apartheid. And in particular, the original framing of what became known as the Montfleur scenarios is that it was going to be a scenario planning exercise from the left. So what they had done was compose a group that was in some ways a microcosm of the South African leadership at the time: opposition and establishment, black and white, left and right. The Montfleur team developed a set of scenarios for how the transition in South Africa might be affected. They're not really relevant now, but in 1991, when the work was done, they expressed important questions and challenges about the future. So I really found this very interesting, that here were a group of people, very powerful, from all different walks of life, people who in one way or another had all sacrificed enormously and were very committed to the future of South Africa, putting their power together in a way that was constructive and creative. So this was my first experience with this kind of collective power, this use of power to create something together. And this idea that actually what matters in power is who has it and who doesn't have it, and in particular, the way in which power can create oppression and suffering. That it's one thing for people to be vigorously pushing for what they want, but in certain circumstances, certainly the circumstances as he saw it in South Africa up to that time, the result of such power was suffering. So there's something else going on here with power, more than I was understanding. Okay. The second story I want to tell you occurred in 1998. I had moved to South Africa. I was starting to do this kind of multi-stakeholder problem-solving work, and I received a request from a group in the country of Guatemala which had heard about the Montfleur exercise and wanted to use it there. I don't know how many of you know much about Guatemala. It's a small country in Central America, just south of Mexico. It has the dubious distinction of having had the longest running and most brutal civil war in the Americas. a 36-year war, 1960 to 1996. In 1996, a peace treaty was negotiated, one of the great international peacekeeping accomplishments of the 1990s. And I started to work there in 1998. There was a group called Vision Guatemala, which brought together a group like Montfleur, but at a higher level and more diverse, including church leaders and youth leaders and cabinet ministers and former guerrilla leaders and former military intelligence people. When we interviewed members of the team about all that they had accomplished together, many of them referred to one 5-minute period in the first workshop, 5 minutes of silence, as the moment where their commitment and their understanding of what they needed to do became clear. One evening at that first workshop after dinner, the group gathered and we invited them to tell stories from their own personal experience of what had been going on in the country. And one man, a man named Ronald Orquieta, who was a researcher for the Catholic Church, told the story about having participated or having been the official observer at the exhumation of a grave, a grave from a massacre. There were many such graves, and his investigation was reporting on these graves and what had happened during the war. And he was standing there as the forensics people were taking the earth out of the grave, and he noticed at the bottom of the grave a lot of small bones. And he asked people what had happened here. Did people have their bones broken during the massacre? And they said, no, sir, this is a massacre that included a number of pregnant women, and what you're seeing are the bones of the fetuses. So you can feel a little bit the impact of that story even here, decades later on the other side of the world. Maybe you can imagine what the impact of telling such a story in a group of people sitting in a circle, all of whom in one way or another had been involved in the events that were described. The group became quiet, completely quiet, for maybe 5 minutes. And in my first book, Solving Tough Problems, this Guatemala story, the story about the 5 minutes of communion, was the very pinnacle of the book. It's the explanation in the last chapter about how only in coming together in that oneness can we deal with the complex challenges we face. This really struck me, that there was something about that coming together which could be constructive as it was in Vision Guatemala, but another version of this coming together could actually be weakening. And now I was really confused. So I was trying to understand what's going on here. What is this power? What is this connection or love? How does it work? And I came across a book by a man named Paul Tillich. Tillich defines power as the drive of everything living to realize itself. The drive of everything living to realize itself with increasing intensity and extensity. The clearest image I have of what Tillich means by power is the image of a seed. I don't know if you've ever heard of this NGO called guerrilla gardening. Guerrilla gardeners are people who skulk around in the middle of the night in a built-up area like Belleville. They find a vacant lot covered with rubble or stones, and they put seeds on the ground, knowing that as the seeds grow, they will break through the rubble and create a green space in the city. And this image of the seed breaking through the ground, this is the clearest image I have of what Tillich means by power, the drive of everything living to realize itself with increasing intensity and extensity. Tillich defines love as the drive to reunite the separated. The drive to reunite the separated. And he's being very precise in his language, and when you say the drive to reunite the separated, what you're implying is there is a oneness, there is a wholeness, but which has, or which appears to have been fragmented or broken. In theory, this is simple. Drive to self-realization, drive to reuniting, but in practice it turns out to be not only difficult but dangerous. And the reason it's difficult and dangerous is because, as everybody knows, power has both a generative side, a side that can build things, power to, and a degenerative or a destructive side, power over. These were the two sides that, this was the underside that Paulo Jordan had been referring to. The other reason it's difficult and dangerous to work with power and love is because, as not everybody knows, love also has two sides, both a generative side, an uplifting love, and a degenerative side, a falling down love. I could give you many examples, but maybe the simplest one, which allows us to see the two sides of power and the two sides of love, would be to look at what you might call historically constructed gender roles, where the man represents power and the woman represents love. So the man goes out of the house in the morning with his briefcase. The generative side of his power is that he can create something in the world. He can build something. The degenerative side of his love, of his power, which is the subject of 100 novels and 100 films, is he becomes so focused on this thing he has to do, his destiny, his work in the world, that he becomes disconnected from his colleagues, from his family, from himself, and he becomes a robot or a tyrant. So these are the two sides of power. What I didn't realize until somebody pointed out to me is we can also see the two sides of love in the historically constructed role of the woman. The generative side of the woman's love is that she both figuratively and literally gives life to the family. The degenerative side of her love is that she can become so focused on this nurturing and this holding together and this protecting that she undermines the power of the other members of her family and, much more fundamentally, undermines and weakens her own power. What is it that makes power degenerative rather than generative? It's the lack of love. And what is it that makes love degenerative rather than generative? It's the lack of power. The most famous student of Paul Tillich was Martin Luther King Jr., the great American activist and theologian, civil rights leader. He said, "What we need to realize is that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. It is precisely this collision of immoral power with powerless morality which constitutes the major crisis of our time." The great biographer of Martin Luther King is a man named Taylor Branch. And Branch writes about King that his life was walking a narrow path, trying to avoid, on the one hand, the danger of reckless and abusive power without love, and on the other hand, the danger of sentimental and anemic love without power. What we face in trying to do change work is two monsters. The first monster of power without love is obvious and prevalent. We know what it looks like when everybody's just doing their thing without any sense of connection and the terrible abuses that result. The other danger of love without power is hidden and therefore in a certain way more insidious, a connection that undermines self-realization. So, what does it take to effect change? What does it take to effect change peacefully in the increasingly complex and confusing and conflictual contexts in which we all find ourselves? It takes learning to choose both. Thank you.